is the DeFi Decoded podcast by 9 Point Partners. The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast should not be taken as investment advice. Always consult with your financial advisor before investing.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of DeFi Decoded. I am Alex Tapscott here with Andrew Young. The collapse of FTX has cast a long shadow over Web3. Critics argue that the company's failure is proof that this new technology, while perhaps innovative and useful in the hands of central banks and big companies, is a net negative to society when left to the free market, giving speculators new ways to gamble and criminals new tools to evade law enforcement. Indeed, as the trial of FTX founder SBF Sam Bankman-Fried really ramps up here, the New York Times tells us that crypto itself is on trial and that the case will surely shine a harsh glare on all in the industry, like a black light on the proverbial hotel bedspread. Tying the fate of the industry to a spectacular failure does fit a familiar pattern. The South Sea bubble was blamed on the corporation itself, the joint stock company, and after that, it took 100 years for a new one to get formed. And in 2009, the New York Times wrote that capitalism itself was on trial for the financial crisis. Sound familiar? In actuality, we can blame the collapse of FTX not on Web3 or specific innovations like tokens, but on the hubris and the misdeeds of those wielding them. More simply put, FTX was likely just garden variety fraud. Yet still, it's the talk of the town, and it's something that everyone has turned their attention to. My hope is that it acts as a punctuation point in the history of this industry, setting sort of a new era in Web3, where we are no longer as reliant or obsessed with the cult of personality around founders or centralized exchanges. But for now, we have to churn through some pretty tawdry details of what's going on in the case. So Andrew, what's your take on what's going on right now in this FTX case?
Yeah, so first of all, the headline is that it's going very poorly for Sam Bankman-Fried. That seems to be the consensus from all the different crypto lawyers or anyone really just following the case. The prosecution's sort of case as of now seems to be overwhelming. And the judge has also ruled against the defense, i.e. SBF, multiple times now. And so, and what they've been doing now is the government obviously flipped a ton of former SBF co-founders, including Gary Wang, Caroline Ellison, and they've been sort of they've been giving their testimony the last couple of days, which has been also incredibly damning. So for as of now, it looks very likely that they'll get him on at least securities fraud. That seems to be the case, or sorry, the charge that seems most likely to sort of stick.
Securities fraud or wire fraud?
I believe securities fraud. Yeah. So that's related to, essentially effectively acting like a bank when they shouldn't have. Whereas I believe the wire fraud is more related to sort of more related to almost like laundering the money and using sort of Alameda's bank accounts to obfuscate FTX's sort of source of funds, which was another huge issue. Actually, quite one that was quite out in the open, because when we've had a couple of people on the pod here who used to do business with FTX, and they said it was weird because when you sent money to FTX, you'd be sending it to Alameda's bank account. So the signs were there, kind of just right out in the open from the start. Yeah, with that being said, it seems like, and Caroline Ellison sort of came out and said that SBF directed her to commit all the crimes. Gary Wang sort of said something similar, and both of them sort of confessed that they didn't know about the hole until sort of later on, like the hole in terms of customer assets. What's also really interesting is it seems like they had been losing and dipping into customer assets from the very beginning. And it wasn't like some sort of hole that got blown open, in the last year, which it did sort of happen a little bit in terms of like Terra Luna. When Terra Luna crashed, Alameda was on the other side of that. And so when the Terra just kept going down, they were sort of getting hit the whole way down, expecting it to mean revert, which obviously it didn't. But yeah, the losses are just staggering. One thing that is really interesting, the sort of battle that's happening right now, is FTX made an investment into this AI startup called
Uh,
sorry,
Anthropic. I'm so glad you're bringing
Anthropic
this.
AI.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're bringing this up. Go ahead. Yeah, it's this interesting.
Oh no, I mean I'll just give the headline. So essentially, I believe they invested $500 million, and the company's valuation has since 10x. So on paper, they're up $5 billion on this investment, this venture investment. It's obviously quite illiquid, but private AI startups are incredibly hot right now. Like it's kind of like the main area that VCs are playing, and you actually
Yeah,
see a
like
lot of
I
crypto
think that
VCs.
like OpenAI was the first to strike a big deal with a large tech company in Microsoft, and I think it's Anthropic struck this huge deal with Amazon, I believe, after actually receiving an initial investment from Google. So like this Anthropic company is getting caught up in this fervor from big tech to try and like build a beachhead in the AI wars, and somehow it's dragged along all of the FTX creditors with it. So, like there are customers and creditors and vendors and blah, 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 that are all in line to receive some compensation from this liquidation process. And it appears that the re-rating on this Anthropic deal will help to get them not, I don't know if all the way whole or not, but it's certainly going to improve their return materially, which is a very interesting thing in a way. There's probably some psychology there to dissect. But anyway, yeah, it's kind of a fascinating thing. So like what's next? Because I think we don't really want to cover this trial like week to week. We're not lawyers and journalists. It is interesting and material, I suppose, to the industry on a day-to-day basis. But like, what does the next little while look like, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Sorry, like just to add on to that point. So the prosecution is trying to prevent the introduction of this piece of evidence into the court. The fact that this sort of lucky investment in Anthropic AI might just make all customers whole, or effectively mostly cover the customer hole,
Yeah.
which is just kind of a wild thing that this
Yeah.
random AI investment. So that's the current battle. And I mean, that's actually incredibly bullish for crypto people if this essentially the AI boom subsidizes crypto holders.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I
Well,
don't.
as we said on the
Again,
podcast, these technologies are not separate but related. And I've talked about the convergence of these technologies. Now, this isn't exactly what I had in mind, but I'll certainly take it in the short term.
yeah. I mean, like crypto is actually quite dead right now in terms of news coming out. I would say like this is partly why I think everyone's focused on the FTX trial. There hasn't really been a ton of sort of new things coming out. So I mean, I don't know. Like it's interesting. I mean, besides sort of the macro picture, which I think is looks a little bit dire, at least over the next 3 to 6 months, but
Yeah.
potentially looks great in 2024. Just with like inflation expected to come down, the Bitcoin halving sort of coming in Q1 or end of Q1, and then finally just what most people think will be the end of the rate hiking cycle within the next 6 months. So I think like overall, crypto's still got 4 to 6 more months of relative pain. But things look pretty good in 2024. At least there seems to be a lot of pre-programmed catalyst in effect.
And by
But yeah, I mean,
pre-programmed catalyst, you're referring to what exactly?
well, no, those three things, right? So just the fact that just the end of the rate hiking cycle kind of
Yeah.
expected in the next 3 to 6 months. Obviously, that
Okay.
could easily be wrong.
And then the halving.
Bitcoin halving, and then the Bitcoin ETF.
Right.
All three of those things sort of expected to come in the next 4 to 6 months. So yeah, I think crypto, a lot of people like myself, like operators, founders in the space, they're sort of heads down, building. And if they're like me, they're sort of still wait and see on the overall crypto picture, maybe for the next kind of 6 months. But I can kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel, which is great. But yeah, I mean, I know you're also spending a lot of time in the enterprise blockchain space, which is starting to show a little bit more green shoots than I would say the public blockchain space. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that?
Well, what I would say is that enterprise interest in public blockchains is not waning. And I was in New York this past week, well, actually just yesterday, so on October 10th, doing the New York launch for my new book, Web3. And that was hosted at EY, so Ernst & Young, in their global headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. And I was there with Paul Brody, who oversees the blockchain practice group. And he's someone who's written a book called like Ethereum for the Enterprise. And I think that that's sort of a narrative violation. A lot of people think about enterprises, they think about building on, if they're interested at all in this, that they're building on closed proprietary networks. And he made a really interesting point, which is like, the journey for most enterprises is that they can't help themselves, but start with, trying to build on closed networks. In a way, it's reminiscent of the early days of the web. A lot of companies were really interested in the internet, but didn't like the idea of exposing their business in a way to this wild west where there were, criminals and pornographers and other, ne'er-do-wells, which, sound familiar anyway. And so they built these things called intranets that were sort of closed loop systems that tried to replicate some of the functionality of the open web, but they couldn't because the open web is where all the innovation was happening. And, in the early days, maybe a closed network can be as performative or performant as not performative, as performant as, an open network. But over time, the open network is where all of the innovation is occurring, and that's where the growth occurs. So basically, it's a long and short way of saying what Brody has noticed, and this is corroborated by friends I have at Microsoft and most other companies that are interacting with enterprises, is that all enterprise innovation now pretty much is happening on open networks. And a lot of that starts with the Ethereum network. Now I think on the show we've talked about gaming applications and fashion and other consumer facing, companies that are trying out stuff on things like Solana and on layer 2 networks. And that's all true. But when it comes to initial innovation or familiarizing themselves with the technology, it would appear right now that the Ethereum main chain is where they start to do it. Now, what Paul was talking about is a couple interesting sort of terms which I haven't heard before, which is, as we've discussed on the show, a lot of smart contracting platforms have fees that are associated with them. Some of those fees are higher than others. And for a lot of enterprises that are trying to provide services to customers, they don't want the customer to pay the fee. So what they do is they attach a gas tank to the smart contract, which is basically like almost like a prepaid card or like a pre-fueled vehicle, right? Where the gas fee is not paid by the end user. It's sort of like embedded into the transaction. And that's a way for the sort of enterprise to sort of not have to pass the fee through to the consumer. Now, I'm sure it appears in other ways, like any other product or service, but it's not like they're paying an extra surcharge or tax. So I thought that was sort of an interesting part of the discussion. I will say that, the event itself was sold out. We had 225 registrations. So clearly there's a lot of interest from the business and financial community in Web3. And I think that what resonated again with a lot of folks was this idea that, there are several new technologies all emerging at once. And whether it's blockchain or AI or IoT or extended reality, these technologies are not separate, but related. And that's sort of what I was alluding to earlier. Now, it doesn't mean that they're the same thing, but what it means is that just as the term internet went from defining a very narrow set of technologies to defining a whole set of business models and new social behaviors and other phenomenon, the term Web3 is going to, I believe, encompass sort of how these technologies converge on one another. So even the discussion on crypto and Web3, I think, is kind of confusing. I mean, I think we need to just figure out a way to organize a taxonomy. Like if Web3 is at the top, then crypto/blockchain is one category of many. And those are the technologies that are coming together. So there was a lot of discussion around that. The metaverse, extended reality, connected devices, a really interesting discussion around decentralized physical infrastructure. So how do we, create the computing resources and capacity to help sort of underpin and fuel whatever this next revolution looks like, whether it's rendering environments or doing large language models or processing transactions on chain. All of those things are going to require big compute. And so there's a really interesting play there for big companies as well. So just a really interesting discussion, all much more sophisticated, I would say, than what I've seen in the past. There's a general awareness and understanding that public infrastructure is where it's all happening. And I thought that was extremely encouraging. And I thought that the turnout was a reflection of the enduring interest in this subject, which again, I think is kind of at odds with the sentiment, as it were, where everyone's sort of like hanging tight, waiting for, the new year, waiting for the macro situation to blow over, FTX to kind of wind up. There's still lots of building going on, which I think is really encouraging.
Is it all centered around Ethereum? Because obviously, like what you were talking about at the start in terms of like the gas tank, that makes a lot of sense. We actually built something similar. It's called meta transactions. Sort of similar sort of concept where you pay for users' gas fees.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's only really true with Ethereum. If you build your own chain or you use one of the sort of newer L2s or L1s, gas fees are obviously very cheap. Yeah, I'm just kind of curious. Is it all centered around Ethereum? Any other chains that are particularly interesting to them?
Well, I would say that it starts with Ethereum, but I think it moves to L2s. Like, we know the Polygon team pretty well, right? And they've done a terrific job of helping companies in the consumer-facing space kind of onboard kind of low-tech NFT type projects to the L2 network. Whether it's like LVMH or PepsiCo or what have you, or Dior, or, those kinds of things. In terms of like, the deeper sort of technical stuff, I think the journey begins with Ethereum, but it doesn't have to end there, right? I just think that's like the natural place to start. I mean, you have to remember, like 2017, 2016, when I was first talking to big companies about blockchain, I was telling them about Ethereum, and then they would go look at this network, and it was a network with $1 billion, and it just had the DAO, hack, and it was being overrun with crypto kitties, and they're like, this stuff is not ready for prime time. Like, we need to do our own thing. And we like what you're saying, but we think we can work with IBM or something and create a better product. But that's the way it works with all new technologies in the early days. The first people confuse the first instantiation with the end product or the finished result, right? So like whatever it looks like at the beginning is going to somehow be what it's going to look like at the end. Like clearly that's not true. That's not true for cars, computers, it's not true for railways, it's not true for, for smartphones, it's not true for anything. So there's that to consider. And then the other thing is that they are, I just lost my train of thought. So don't confuse the first instantiation with the last would be number one. And then also just, like public blockchains are clearly where other innovators are building. And so enterprises need to connect into other companies and other projects. And so that's important too. Sorry, I finished it up there. Okay.
Yeah. You're doing a world tour right now for your book. Actually, I guess we should probably end with a quick shout out to. I saw Web3 was what was that, top 5 business books in Canada, best-selling business books. It was like after just after the Elon book. So
it was the number 5 business book in the United States, actually. So it was the number 5 on the Wall Street Journal business bestseller list. And it was number 8 on the Globe and Mail nonfiction list. So that's all nonfiction books, including, the kinds of books that like, your parents read and stuff like that. So that was nice to see.
And you've been sort of traveling the world. I mean, we keep recording with a bed in the background for yourself. Are you still crisscrossing the globe for more Web3 promotions, or what's going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, most of the time I'm in Toronto, but every week I go away for like a couple of days. This week it happened to be New York and Miami. Next week's Montreal. The week after that, I'm in Washington and Boston, and and on it goes. If people are interested in that, I would encourage you to check out web3booktour.com, see if there's an event happening in your city. Would love to see you in person.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
All right, cool. Well, that's it for today, Andrew. So hopefully, next week there's some other news to talk about. Just like a roundup of some headlines. JP Morgan announced that it's going live with some internal blockchain project, which, take it for what it is. We saw a big investment bank put an $8,000 price target on Ethereum, talking about demand for RWAs and just smart contracting demand, which is kind of interesting. But that targets into 2026. So it's sort of, to me, that's just funny that that's the kind of oh, well, it's a 4x return. Yeah, well, it's a 4x return over 3 years. So, it's no longer the kinds of expected return I think a lot of people think of when they think of crypto. And in a way, that's sort of reasonable because Ethereum is a large cap, technology platform. If it goes up 4x in 3 years, I think people would be delighted. If Google went up 4x in 3 years, people would feel pretty good about that, right? So interesting to see just this kind of steady stream of predictions and information coming out of these big firms. But yeah, like you said, kind of a slow week. So I think we'll just wrap it up there. Thanks everyone for joining. We'll be back in town tomorrow. And until then, have a great week. We'll see you later. Bye.
The information contained herein does not constitute an offer or solicitation by anyone in the United States or in any other jurisdiction in which such an offer or solicitation is not authorized, or to any person to whom it is unlawful to make such an offer or solicitation. Prospective investors who are not residents in Canada should contact their financial advisor to determine whether securities of the funds may be lawfully sold in their jurisdiction.